Do we find it acceptable that we've got 19 million people in this country on the edge of poverty, the very edge of poverty, even though most of them actually have a job? Do we find that acceptable? Do we find it acceptable that this government is certifying tens of thousands of people fit for work who are then dying soon afterwards? Is that acceptable to us? Is it acceptable to us that we have people dying on our street now? Soaring homelessness, soaring malnutrition, soaring child poverty. Is that acceptable to us? Because these are the questions that the people in this country have got to ask themselves on the 8th of June. It's not about whether or not they prefer Jeremy Corbyn or Theresa May. It's about the type of country that they want to live in and what is acceptable to us. Theresa May doesn't speak for the values of the people in this country. You know, I was really struck just 2 weeks ago. I switched on the news, and there was Nigel Farage, and he was in the European Parliament, and he was calling the members of the European Parliament mafia, and he was calling them gangsters. Well, you know, he's entitled to his opinion, but do remember that these people put justice at the very heart of their relationship with other countries. They fight against discrimination and oppression. But what really struck me is that on that very same day, almost at that very same moment that Nigel Farage was calling the European Parliament gangsters and mafias, we had Theresa May in the Gulf. And she was sucking up to Saudi Arabia for a trade deal. And Saudi Arabia is a country that serially abuses human rights. It's a country that thinks it's acceptable to execute people by chopping off their heads. So, on the same day that she's in Saudi Arabia calling these people our friends, we've got Nigel Farage in the European Parliament calling our friends in Europe mafia and gangsters. And it gets worse, because we all know that Saudi Arabia is bombing the hell out of Yemen. And it's doing that with billions of pounds worth of weapons that we've sold them. And Theresa May says, well, it's all right, because one, we want a trade deal, and two, we're going to send Yemen some aid. Well, that aid that we send Yemen isn't going to bring back the one child that dies every 10 minutes in Yemen, not just from bombing, but from starvation, malnutrition. It's not going to help 7 million people that are on the verge of starvation in Yemen. So, you know, something makes me feel really sick inside when I hear Theresa May giving speeches talking about British values, because she doesn't know what British values are. Because in this country we fight discrimination and we stand up for human rights. And that means that we don't go off to Saudi Arabia sucking up to countries that serially abuse human rights. We just don't do that. That's not who we are. We can't believe a single word that Theresa May says. And that the people in this country are being treated by her as if we're ignorant serfs that simply don't know what's going on. Let me read you a couple of headlines that have really struck me from the newspapers during the last 2 weeks. And the first one is a headline that appeared in the Telegraph. And this appeared on the very day that Labour announced a policy to make sure that every primary school child got one decent hot meal every day. And this is the headline put out by the Telegraph within hours of that policy being announced. And it was this: Labour's plan to tax private school fees in tatters. Within hours of the policy being announced, the Telegraph put out a heading: the policy's in tatters. So why is the Telegraph saying within an hour this policy is in tatters? Well, this is why. And this is from the Telegraph article. Questions have been raised about the evidence to justify the policy. Well, hang on a minute. We've got 4 million million children in this country living in poverty. The IFS says that's going to increase to 5.1 million children living in poverty within the next 2 years. We've got 1 million people reliant on food bank handouts to survive. 400,000 of them are children. And we've just seen this new phenomenon, as it's being referred to as school holiday hunger. Children coming back to school after the school holidays malnourished. How did this become acceptable in this country? And these are the issues that should be thought about on the 8th of June. It's quite simply, what kind of a country, what kind of a nation do we want? Is this acceptable? Is child poverty and hunger acceptable? Now, let's move on to another headline on the same day that appeared in the Daily Fail. And it was this. It was a shocking headline, the same day, within hours of the policy being announced. And it said, Corbyn under fire for plans to tax private school fees. Under fire. Well, if we just sit on the shelf for a moment, that we're talking about VAT on school fees for 7%, the wealthiest 7% of the people in this country. So 93% will benefit from it. Put that on the shelf for one moment. Corbyn and Labour come under fire because they want to ensure that every child has one decent hot meal every day. How can anyone be putting Labour under fire for wanting that? What kind of a nation have we become if we allow that to happen? And the Telegraph, coming back to the Telegraph again, later that day they put out another article with another heading. And it was this: Theresa May's answer on free school meals shows how irrelevant Labour has become. So what was Theresa May's answer that showed how irrelevant Labour had become? I'll tell you what the answer was. It was no answer. Nothing. She had no comment to make. Theresa May didn't even think it worthy of a comment that we want to ensure that every child has one decent hot meal every day. How extraordinary. How extraordinary is that? I joined the Labour Party because I wanted to support Jeremy Corbyn in beating the Tories. With what I've seen during the last week from the Tory party in its reaction to a policy that wants to ensure every child has one decent hot meal every day, and from what I've seen from their controlled, biased right-wing media, it's not good enough to beat the Tory party anymore. They have to be crushed once and for all. Don't speak to me about these polls that we see flying around. You know, somebody said to me a week ago, have you seen this poll, which says that Labour voters would rather have Theresa May as Prime Minister? And I said, yeah, that's the poll that was funded by a wealthy Tory donor that was reported in the Evening Standard, the editor of which is a senior Tory politician. I'm going to be really worried about that.